So right in my hands I have the Moto G Power 2023, and you might be wondering how good this budget phone is, especially when you see it on a lot of prepaid carriers for $100 or $150. I have the unlocked model right here that retails at $300, but even on Prime Day there's been a lot of great sales on it for around $250, and you might be wondering if this phone is worth it, and to be honest, I've been super impressed with this phone. So with all that being said, let's get into my full thoughts with a full review on the Moto G Power 2023. So budget phones lately have been slept on. A lot of people say they shouldn't even exist. They tell you to go buy a used flagship phone. And a lot of people just don't see the value in phones like this. But I am so impressed with how far budget phones have come. I remember years ago where they were pretty much unusable, but nowadays you could get a phone for $200, for $250, or even $100 at times, and you can get a phone that is absolutely terrific, and this is one of those times. Now granted, this phone does have some compromises. If you look at the design of this phone, you will see a plastic back. But this phone does have a lot of great things that other mid-range phones have, but it has it at a much better price. For example, this phone does have a headphone jack, which honestly you don't even get in a lot of mid-range phones. It has an SD card slot, which again, you don't get in a lot of other phones either. Of course, it does have a fingerprint sensor in the power button, and a lot of us actually prefer that over the fingerprint sensor in the screen anyway. So sure, there are some compromises, especially if you wanted an in-screen fingerprint reader, but at least you do get a quick and reliable fingerprint sensor here. You even get two speakers on this that are pretty loud. Granted, they're not the best quality, but you do get a little bit of a speaker up on the top of the display, and you do get a speaker on the bottom as well. So the design isn't so great. That's really the main area that this phone does compromise in. It does have a little bit of splash resistance, but you're not going to get great water resistance where you could put your phone in a pool for 30 minutes. But if you look past that, what you're going to see is finally, at a reasonable price, we can get phones that perform well, with great displays, with high refresh rate screens. And that's something that we did not have even a couple of years ago. We used to get 120 Hertz, but the screen would only be 720p, so the resolution would be bad on the screen, or the performance would not be good at all on the phone. Well, now we get a really good processor in this phone with a good display and 120 Hertz. So this is a 6.5 inch screen. It's a 2400 by 1080 resolution on the screen. So we get a 1080p screen, but not only that, we of course get that smooth refresh rate. And the refresh rate, a lot of times when they put that on lower end phones, it's really hampered by the poor performance that you get with the processor it comes with. But this phone actually has decent speed, so whenever I'm using this phone, it feels very smooth to scroll through. It feels great whenever I'm scrolling through the menus, and when I'm using it, of course, in various applications, when I'm multitasking, everything feels smooth, but of course the display itself, it just looks very, very nice. So it's an IPS LCD display, so again, you're not getting AMOLED, but I would not expect it at this price, but the screen still looks good, the colors look good for the display for at least what it is. I understand if you are paying a full $300 on that retail price, it might be losing out to some competitors. Maybe the Google Pixel 6a, that phone has been on sale quite a bit, so I understand you might be able to get that phone for $250 or $300. It does have a really nice AMOLED display, but that display is only 60 Hertz. And another thing you have to remember is that this phone will go on sale a lot. Again, if you look at prepaid carriers, you're already seeing it for like $100. It might even be free at your prepaid carrier. And if you're buying it unlocked, this phone has already gone on sale to $250, and I would expect it will go down to $200 and even $150 pretty soon anyway, because Motorola phones do drop in price pretty rapidly. So for that money, to get an IPS LCD display, 120 Hertz, that's going to be terrific, and to get this nice resolution, that is great as well. But again, the performance is what really impressed me on this phone. Now it's 6 gigabytes of RAM, and it's got a Dimensity processor from MediaTek. It's a Dimensity 930, and overall, I was blown away by how good this phone performed. I was expecting this phone to be very slow and sluggish, but almost everything that I did on this phone was actually pretty smooth. Now, there were occasional hiccups that you would get, but outside of some minor hiccups, I was able to multitask quickly, go between apps, I was able to scroll through everything I wanted to do. Now, I know I'm not a heavy gamer or anything like that, but I was still able to use this phone and really fly through pretty much anything that I was able to use. Now, I will say as well, I am a high-end phone user, and for a lot of you out there, you like high-end phones too. But what's amazing about that is a lot of times when high-end phone reviewers, they go to review those budget phones, they just say, oh, it's sluggish because it's not as good as my $1,000 phone. And that's a pretty regular review that you get. They don't say it's fast for the money. Instead, they just say it's slow and it's not very good. But this phone, in my experience, even as a user of regular high-end phones, it's actually very, very good with that performance. And I was really thinking as I was using it that I wasn't missing a flagship phone. Of course, if you do love flagship phones, if that's all you love, if that's where your expectations are, of course this will disappoint you. And a lot of high-end reviewers, they're still going to say this phone is slow because they don't put themselves in the shoes of someone who would buy this phone anyway. That's a normal problem with tech reviewers. But I'm here to say that if you are someone who has been buying phones around $100, $200, or $300, this phone is going to absolutely blow you away as far as the performance. It's very similar to something like a Snapdragon 750, for example. It's going to be around that range as far as the performance. The gaming performance won't be great, but if you do play games like Mario Kart or Angry Birds or Madden, those type of games don't really need high-end performance anyway, and those games are going to work just fine on this. Of course, if you are a super high-end gamer, of course this phone would not be for you. Why are you even looking at this price range anyway? But for me, when I look at it and I see the performance that this has whenever I'm just scrolling around, I have to say that impressed me a lot. Another thing that impressed me, of course, was the battery life. Of course, the battery life would impress me because it is a Moto G Power. It's a 5,000 milliamp battery in it, and of course the processor is pretty efficient as well. It doesn't draw a ton of power anyway, so I was able to get really good battery life on this phone. Now, it's not as good as some of those older Moto G Power phones, those phones that would last like 2 or 3 days, but that's because a lot of those phones had 720p displays, they had really bad performing processors, so of course they would be slower. But this phone, because it does have a better processor, because it is drawing a little more power with that 120 hertz, it's not going to be the best battery you've ever seen in a smartphone, but it's going to be very, very good. I'm talking like 7-8 hours of screen on time. Of course, it depends on if you're using Wi-Fi or if you're using 4G LTE, for example. It really depends on what you're using your phone with, and if you're using cellular data, that does actually impact your battery life. But in my testing, I was getting really, really solid numbers on this phone. Like, the battery life is really, really good, and I would say that's a pretty impressive part of the phone overall. So if you look at the overall package, it's pretty good, right? But there are those compromises that may keep you away from it and that may draw you to something else like a Pixel 6a. For example, the camera. The camera only records video in 1080p, so you don't get 4K video. That's not something that's going to drag down your average consumer, but some people do like 4K video, and the pictures are okay. So you do have 3 different cameras here, and well, they are okay as far as the quality. You have a 50 megapixel main lens, a 2 megapixel depth lens, and a 2 megapixel macro lens. And if I'm honest, I really only think you're going to get one good lens out of this, the main lens, and even that is just going to be okay. Don't expect it to be a great lens that competes with something like a Google Pixel 6a or other phones around $300 to $400. The camera is not really where this phone shines, but it does shine in other areas, right? So even though the pictures are okay, they're not the best in the world, they're not the worst in the world, I think it's going to be serviceable for a lot of people. You have to remember that this has a higher refresh rate than the Google Pixel 6a, for example. This does have really good performance, and that is awesome. And a lot of people are going to find this at a lower price. Of course, if you're comparing it to Prime Day sales or all these other phones that have just gone on sale very, very recently, of course it might not shine because this phone just released. But remember that this phone is going to go on sale soon. It's going to be on sale at a lot of prepaids. And if you find this phone for $200, bucks, for $250, or even lower, you're going to be very impressed. Of course, you're going to get a plastic back. Of course, you're not going to get 4K video. Of course, you're not going to get wireless charging. And one thing that might be a big deal to you, this does not have NFC, so you can't use Google Pay whenever you're trying to buy things at a register. You can't use your phone to pay at really any register, of course. But if you can live with that compromise, if you can live with the fact that this only has a splash resistance as far as water, it's not going to be water resistant to put underwater for 30 minutes. Those are the minor drawbacks. You don't get wireless charging, you don't get those things, but this phone does give you everything you need without making you pay for a ton of extras that a lot of us just don't need. A lot of us just want a really good display, we want a nice refresh rate, we want good battery life, and we want a good performing phone with a decent camera. And this phone does really come through on all of those things, right? The display is great. I had a great time using this phone and I had a great time multitasking on it. It lasted through the day. The camera was serviceable. And for a lot of us, that's all we want in a phone. A lot of people are going to tell you that you need to go buy a $600 phone at your carrier or an $800 phone. And that's just not the case. You could get a really nice phone with this phone and not have to spend all that money. So would I recommend this phone? Absolutely. I think it's a great competitor. But I will say, if you're out there, you see this for $300. I love that the $300 model comes with 256 gigabytes. And I will warn you about this. Sometimes those prepaid models for $100, sometimes they have 4 gigabytes of RAM instead of 6. Sometimes they have less storage, like 128 gigabytes, for example. You may see some of those very minor differences in those prepaid models. But if you go beyond that, I will say $300 seems like a little bit too much for this phone, but I don't want that to affect my review. A lot of people out there, again, when they review phones, they'll just look at the here and now and look at the price and say, no, I wouldn't recommend it. But I have to go beyond that to realize that this phone is going to go on sale pretty quickly. And if you see this phone for $250 again or below, I would say this phone is going to be a terrific buy. This phone is for those people who don't want the best camera, but they want other things like better battery life, for example. If you want a far better camera, but you're willing to really sacrifice on some things like battery life or refresh rate, the Google Pixel 6a is going to be a very good recommendation for me. If you find that for $300 or for $250, the Pixel 6a has one of the best cameras you could buy for that money, but it does sacrifice with battery life and it does sacrifice in a couple of other areas as well. But if you're willing to go with a plastic back, you're going to get a few things that the Pixel 6a doesn't have. You're going to get a headphone jack, you're going to get an SD card slot, you're going to get a 120 Hz refresh rate, and you're not going to get the best camera, but you will still get a decent serviceable camera with some other cool perks on the phone. And by the way, I love Motorola phones. They are pretty stock as far as their software. I love that. I love that you could do this and you could turn on your flashlight just by shaking the phone. They have a lot of really cool gestures on the phone, a lot of things I like about it. So overall, I would highly recommend this phone if you find it on sale or if you find it at a prepaid carrier. At $300, it's still a good phone. I'm not saying it's a bad buy, but I would say there might be some other better buys that are on sale already. So hopefully this review has helped you. I really hope you really consider this phone if you are in the budget range looking for a phone around $300 or less, especially $250 or less. It's really good. Please check the links in the description. That is one of the best ways you could support me as a creator, because if you use those links, I may earn a commission, and this really does help keep me going, right? And also give me a like on this video, give me a sub, that would mean a ton, and check out some other videos if you get a little bit of time.